The Scream Kings are in no way responsible for any encounters with the paranormal, extraterrestrial abductions, eldritch insanity, hauntings, curses, hexes, demonic possessions, cryptozoological sightings, or any loss of sleep that may result from listening to this podcast.
This is the Scream Kings podcast. I'm Max George.
And I'm Nathaniel Darkish. I don't want to kill you.
But I will if I have to. I'm so excited for this episode.
Me too.
Oh, this is a huge milestone for the Scream Kings.
Definitely. What we're referencing here is the fact that this is our very first interview episode. Specifically, who we interviewed for this wonderful, amazing episode I interviewed, because unfortunately Max wasn't able to be present. I interviewed author Dan Wells. Now, I give him a full introduction in the interview section, which we'll jump to in a minute, but I'm just really excited that I was able to sit down with an author that I really admire and really enjoy his work, and so this is just a really cool episode for us.
Like I said, a huge milestone, I think, for our podcast, in that we are finally branching out a little bit and engaging with the community, and someone as kind of influential and amazing as Dan Wells. This is just a huge honor for the podcast, and I'm so appreciative of him for doing this for us.
I said thank you probably a dozen times in my interview, but I'm going to just say it again right here. Thanks, Dan, for being on our podcast. It's super awesome. So, I guess without further ado, let's jump into the interview. We have a very special interview today with author Dan Wells. Dan is a Whitney Award and Hugo-nominated New York Times bestselling author of 14 novels and 5 novellas, mostly horror and sci-fi. His works have been adapted into a film and also a play. He writes for BYU TV's series Extinct. He's also the co-host of the Hugo Award-winning podcast Writing Excuses. Did I miss anything there?
No, that was very that was impressively thorough. I don't even know how many novellas I have in print. So 5, apparently. That's good to know. Thank you.
But yeah, so I just kind of wanted to get a little bit from you about your background with the horror genre, how you got into it, what are some of your favorites, just kind of whatever you want to share there.
Well, I have a strange relationship with horror, I think. I did not, for most of my life, consider myself a horror fan. But I think that's because I'm not really a slasher movie fan, and I share America's misunderstanding of what the horror genre really is. It encompasses so much more than kind of standard horny teens getting murdered slasher movie, which is what most people think of when you say the word horror. There's a lot of other stuff, and so I started writing having grown up reading epic fantasy novels, and kind of assumed I would be an epic fantasy novelist as well. And none of those books really worked, and it was not until I tried horror, kind of on a dare from my writing group more than anything else, that I found the genre where I fit. And it was with I'm Not a Serial Killer, which is, again, it's not really a slasher thing. It's more of an atmospheric, psychological study of someone who's trying to be good while surrounded by evil. And that just, as weird as it sounds in most places to say it, that felt very comfortable. It felt like coming home. I assume on a podcast called Scream Kings I can say something like that and people won't look at me weird. So it's nice to be among my people here.
Yeah, I definitely feel like a lot of times people do focus so much on the slasher horror that a lot of the best examples of the genre kind of fall to the wayside. So I guess what are some of your favorite examples of horror, be it in literature or movies or whatever?
Oh, man. That's a wide open question, isn't it? So I realized as I started writing this book and thinking, why does this feel so natural if I've never read horror? I realized that I actually have experienced a lot of it, and we just don't tend to think of it that way. Obviously Edgar Allan Poe and that kind of literary tradition. A lot of the Russian literature that I read all through high school and college. That was one of my specialties in college. My favorite horror short story is one that is not usually considered horror. It's called The Yellow Wallpaper. And if anyone out there has read it, they probably read it as part of a high school or college literature class that was talking about feminism. Because the story is about a woman who is having some kind of mental issues, and they're never really explained. And the diagnosis, or I guess the prescription for that, the solution to the problem, is that she's confined to bed rest because they think that'll help her. And basically, it just drives her mad. She goes stir crazy, never allowed to leave the room that has this creepy wallpaper, and she completely loses her mind. And yes, I'm not going to deny that that's, a classic piece of feminist literature, but it's also fundamentally terrifying in the way that it depicts a mind falling apart from the inside. And stuff like that is what horror is really made of. Horror films, I kind of feel like we're in a renaissance of those right now. I mean, we've always had here and there really good ones, but a couple years ago we had It Follows, and I feel like that kind of kicked off a new wave of just great stuff. Like right now, The Quiet Place is just blowing records away right and left. People who are not horror people are going out and watching it. Even my parents, who are not horror people at all, they're like, oh yeah, we want to go see The Quiet Place. It sounds awesome. And so for whatever reason, I feel like there's a lot of horror films right now that are just great examples of what horror can do.
Personally, I really am enjoying being able to share the horror that, is bringing people into these theaters that, they wouldn't otherwise be seeing, and kind of using that as an entry point to sharing a lot of other things that I really love. So it's really cool to see that Renaissance is kind of opening new doors that were previously closed.
It really is. And, I haven't made any kind of specific study of it, so me pointing to It Follows as the kind of tip of the spear is probably inaccurate. It almost certainly is. But there's just a lot of really exciting things going on. Like 2016, which is when my movie came out. That's also the year that Train to Busan came out. It was so hard to pick the best horror movie of that year. There were 2 or 3 others that I just thought were spectacular, and I can't even remember the names of now, and I feel bad. But we're in the middle of, I think, a bumper crop of fantastic horror.
Agreed. Definitely. I've enjoyed seeing I Am Not a Serial Killer at the top of a lot of these lists.
Yeah, it has been. The movie has been very well received by the people who've seen it, which sadly has not been a ton. I don't feel like the studio's really done a lot to push it, but the people who've seen it tend to love it. It's one of the... on Netflix, it has one of the highest user ratings of any horror movie that they've got on there. Christopher Lloyd won an acting award, Best Supporting Actor, from one of the horror movie podcasts that's big in the industry. So it's been great to watch people see that. It's also, and anecdotally I can say, as I go around to conventions, more and more often when I am talking about my books, people will say, oh yeah, I saw that movie, that was great. So that's a good sign.
Yeah, definitely. And I've even had some instances where it's kind of come up in unexpected places. Like my father-in-law mentioned just watching it. He's like, oh hey, have you seen this horror movie on Netflix? And I'm like, oh yeah, and I've read all of the books, and I've met you at conventions, so it was kind of a fun thing to see how just it kind of randomly popped up even for me.
That's awesome.
So I guess let's maybe talk a little bit more about the movie, and then we'll kind of talk about the books. But so what was your experience as far as making the movie? I know that you aren't necessarily the big shaker and mover in terms of the production of the film, but I know that you were more involved than most writers.
Yeah, it was a fairly small indie production, And because of that, I got to be much more involved than most authors are, which is great. So that movie actually came about, at this point, I want to say 7 years ago. The book had not been out for more than a couple of years. And the director, Billy O'Brien, he was in, I can't remember if it was Ireland or England. He's Irish, but he lives in England. And one of the two places, he just kind of was looking for a project and stumbled across it in a bookstore. And just read it and loved it and emailed me directly. And, you know, after we kind of signed all the papers, then we had to sit on it for about 5 years because he was such a small fish, so to speak. And the Irish Film Board kept the rights alive, which was wonderful of them. And for 5 years, they were out there kind of just hitting the pavement, going from door to door with producers in Hollywood and all over, trying to find investors who were willing to help get the movie made. And then when it was made, you know, when that money finally showed up, then we went into super fast mode. Like we were running around crazy because we had the money, but we wouldn't have it for long. We had to start getting into production within months. And so that's when we did all the casting. And at that point, after 5 years, I'd come to know Billy well enough that he actually came over and he stayed in my house. This is when I lived in Germany, so it was a quick kind of trip across the channel for him. And he came over with one of the producers, and we just kind of went through everything. We talked about casting. We talked about visual design. We polished up a lot of the things that he'd spent 5 years working on, so that then we could go right into production. And I actually got to spend about 10 days on set when they were filming. I was there for most of the exterior stuff. All of the indoor shots were done in Minneapolis, and all of the outside stuff was done in a place called Virginia, a little town called Virginia that's like 3 hours north of Minneapolis. And that's where I was up in Virginia, Minnesota. It was incredibly cold.
so lucky you got to be for all of the most freezing cold shots.
Yeah, and you know, most of those, the reasons that they're so cold is because it's the middle of the night and people are getting murdered. And so we had Chris Lloyd there, and at the end of one of very particularly kind of nasty scene, it's the one where John comes across a big like semi-trailer, like a big diesel truck that's left with its engines running and the lights on, and he kind of walks around the side and comes into the front, and there in the headlights is the monster ripping a guy apart. And we filmed all of that at like 1 in the morning. It was something like 20 or 30 degrees below zero, just freakishly, stupidly cold. And we had Chris Lloyd and Max Records screaming at each other over and over for take after take. And when we finally finished and we went back to the hotel and we were all kind of huddled around trying to warm up again after this emotionally grueling, physically taxing thing, Chris Lloyd came up to me and said, "Never write a scene like that again." Which is one of my favorite stories from the shoot. It's not every day that a film legend tells you to stop doing your job. But it was great. We had a lot of fun on set. We would love to get back together again and make the sequels, but that's up to the distributor, and at least thus far they haven't shown any particular interest in it. So we'll just keep our fingers crossed and be ready next time money shows up out of nowhere.
Yeah, definitely. I'd say probably my favorite book in the series, maybe like 3 or 4. So I would love to see that in film, but we'll have to see what happens there.
Yeah, I think at this point that it is very unlikely that this particular production will have sequels, but there was a lot of interest from a lot of different companies before, so we're kind of keeping that in our back pocket, and you know, if we get more movies with this group, that's fantastic and I love them. If we don't, the rights will eventually revert, and then we've got some other people we can go to and say, "Hey, remember that thing you asked if they were free? Well, they're free now." So we'll see what happens.
Either way, super awesome. So I guess going on to the casting choices, obviously Christopher Lloyd is mind-bogglingly awesome to have. How did you feel about all of the casting choices?
I thought they really did a good job. Max Records was actually the first guy that we got on board. And there are a couple different versions of this story, but they all boil down to the director or not the director, but one of the producers and I both independently picked Max Records and told the director, hey, this guy would be fantastic for John Cleaver. You should look into him. And so having received that from both sides, the director went and talked to him and loved him as much as we do. So we're really glad. He actually, we got him just a year or two after Where the Wild Things Are, which was his first big movie. And he stayed on the hook with us for most of those 5 years. Just kind of gentleman's agreement. Once you get the money, let me know, and I'm more than happy to do this movie. And so when it finally happened, we went to him, and he said, sure. And we are so glad that we had him. I thought he was just stellar. And of course, Chris Lloyd made the movie work as well. But what really made it special for me were a lot of the side parts. The woman named Dee, who plays Kay Crowley, Chris Lloyd's wife, she's really kind of the emotional center of the movie. We had Laura Fraser as John Cleaver's mom, and she was just spectacular. I thought she did a great job as, that kind of mom who's in way over her head. I've got 6 kids of my own, and if any of them were even vaguely similar to John Cleaver, I don't know how I would deal with it. But Laura Fraser did a very good job. And, all the other people, the Lucy who played Brooke, and Ray Ray who played Max, and the woman who played Margaret, and I can't remember her name off the top of my head, and I feel bad about that. But she was just phenomenal. Like, I would like to get sequels just so we can get more of Margaret and more of Brooke, because those two actors in particular, they've got so much more range than we were able to show with their relatively minor roles in the movie.
Yeah, and definitely some sequels would really show that off.
Absolutely. In fact, with Lucy, one of the issues that we ran into a lot during those 5 years trying to raise the money to make the movie is that you really can't, at least for now, make a movie with a teenage boy as a headliner. For whatever reason, that just doesn't fly. There's nobody in those demographics who can carry a full movie on their shoulders. But you can do it with a teenage girl. You look into the past, back when they were teenagers, someone like Selena Gomez or someone like Jennifer Lawrence, they can totally carry movies. They can headline movies. And that's still true today. It's much easier to get financing for a movie with a female teenage lead than with a male teenage lead. And so we had more than one producer ask us, would you be willing to make this movie if we made John Cleaver a girl? If we did Jane Cleaver? We decided to stick with a boy for the role because we liked the kind of father-son twisted dynamic of him and the monster. But once we met Lucy, who played Brooke, we realized, she totally could have been our John Cleaver, and that would have been just amazing. So I would love to see what she could do with the much meatier roles that Brooke has in the later books.
One thing that I know that I've heard you mention at some conventions is that the ending being different for the film was something that was a concern back when it was at the script level, but then it kind of changed your mind once you actually saw the film. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, and more than anything, that's just because I am very inexperienced with screenplays. It's something I'm trying to teach myself. I wrote for a TV show last year, like you said. But at the time that we started the movie, I didn't really know how screenplays worked. And so when they sent me their draft, and they went through many, many, many drafts before they ended up with the final one that they used for the movie. And they eventually sent me this one where they had changed the ending. and I read it and I thought it was just a disaster. I thought it was going to fail profoundly. And to be fair, it was an ending I'd already kind of tried in book form and couldn't make it work. But it does work on the screen, and that's why I talk about my own inexperience with screenplays. The ending from the movie would not have worked in the book at all. But the ending from the book I don't think would have worked in the movie either, because the different mediums have very different needs, and they have very different abilities and different strengths. And so I think it was very smart of Billy and also Christopher Hyde, who was the kind of the co-screenwriter, to see that and to tweak the ending so that it worked on film.
So one thing that really strikes me about the film is it feels very nostalgic in terms of its style. It feels very 80s horror. And do you think that there's anything about the story that really made it work with that sort of style?
I'm not sure if there's anything intrinsic to the story. The director, and in particular the cinematographer, Robbie, they really wanted to give it kind of an old school 70s look to it. They shot it on film. It's actually the very last movie made, to our knowledge, on Kodak film, because that film company went out of business. And Robbie, with his own money, went out and he bought 2 movies worth of film and then a fridge to keep them in his garage so that they wouldn't go bad. And he hasn't used that other movie worth of film yet. And until he does, we're pretty sure that we're the last movie ever made with Kodak film. And because it has that film quality, it does have a very tactile, different feel to it than video and digital, which is what most movies are made with today. And so it does have a very nostalgic quality to it in the way that it looks and the way that it feels to watch it. I don't know if that comes from my story at all, other than the fact that it's small town America, but the two styles do mesh together very well.
Agreed. So let's kind of move on to the John Cleaver books. One thing I wanted to touch on is just to hear a little bit about your process in terms of kind of planning out the book, what sort of research you're doing in terms of looking into mental illness, and also about the serial killers.
Well, kind of the incentive, the impetus to write the book in the first place was because I've always already been fascinated with serial killers in the same way that John is in the story. And so I had this kind of armchair historian knowledge sitting in the back of my mind anyway, with no real outlet. And I eventually, like I said, my writing group kind of talked me into doing a horror movie based on that concept of the kid with all the markers, all the predictors for serial killer behavior, but who's trying to avoid them and trying to be good. And so his obsession with serial killers kind of is my own obsession as well. That's the one place where John and I really overlap quite a bit. And so I didn't have to do a ton of research into that. I still did, because I wanted to make sure I got all my facts straight. But the majority of the research that I had to do was in criminal profiling, which is kind of an offshoot of serial killer lore, and also in mortuary science, to make sure that I described how embalming actually works and describe it well enough that someone who knows what they're talking about won't throw the book across the room. That took a lot of study, and I think I did a pretty good job. I've had a couple of morticians ask me where I studied, so I feel like that's a victory.
Definitely. So one thing that's present in both those books and also in The Hollow City is mental illness. And I know that at panels, I've heard you mention that accurate portrayal of mental illness is something that is definitely a goal when you were writing all of those books. Can you share a little bit more about why you feel like that's important, and also kind of what sort of research you had to do there?
Yeah, absolutely. Mental illness, mental health is kind of a I don't want to say a hobby horse, but it is a topic that is very close to me and that I feel very strongly about. I've been in a couple of different anthologies designed to raise awareness of mental health. I edited one of them with my brother called Altered Perceptions. The other one just came out a couple weeks ago. It's called Life Inside My Mind. And part of that is because of my own family. I've got children with mental health issues. I've got siblings with mental health issues. My grandparents. The essay that I wrote for Life Inside My Mind was about my grandparents' struggle with Alzheimer's and how I was living with them, helping them through that. And in learning about mental health, I learned some very disturbing statistics. And I won't soapbox for you right now, except to say that everyone needs to go out and learn what they can about recognizing and helping people with mental health issues. But kind of one of the basic things that I learned very quickly is that mental health, when it is portrayed in entertainment media, is almost always either demonized or canonized. On the one hand, you've got something like Silence of the Lambs, where part of the reason that the villain is evil is because they are transgender. And transgender is not really a mental health issue, so that's not a spectacular example to use. But the idea that someone is evil because they have a mental health problem is very prevalent in our society. If you look at television, especially stuff like Law and Order and all the CSI clones, if there's a character with a mental health problem on television, the odds are actually very good that they are going to be a violent antagonist in some way, which is the opposite of real life. People with mental health are actually much less prone to violence than people with no mental health issues at all. And yet we tend to portray them as bad guys. I'm sorry, what was that?
Oh, sorry, and much more likely to be victims of violence.
Yes, exactly. In real life, they're more likely to be the victims of violence, and on television and in movies, they're more likely to be the perpetrators of it. On the other hand, you've got something like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which really just presents very serious life-altering mental health issues as a lifestyle choice. And that kind of overwhelming sense of who are we to decide what is normal and how they should live their lives. They should be free to believe anything that they want. That's a nice sentiment, but in practice, if people have severe mental health issues that is affecting their ability to function in society, that is a problem, and they need help. They need treatment the same as anyone else who is sick. And you can look at that old kind of canonized attitude that you can see in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest really affected a lot of national policy. Ronald Reagan shut down a ton of mental health institutions, just a phenomenal number of mental health institutions, because of that attitude that we should just allow people to believe what they want. And so there needs to be a safer middle ground, one where we're not forcing people into certain patterns and certain thoughts, but one where we are helping people who need our help. It is in America today, you are something like 10 to 20 times more likely to be in prison than in therapy if you have a mental health problem. And that's just unconscionable. We need to be better as a society. So when I write my books, I don't have mental health issues in all of them, but I do have in a lot of them. Hollow City, like you mentioned, in the John Cleaver series, there was a character in the Partial series with autism. I try to use these characters and I try to present them as neutrally as possible, if that's the right word, to say, here is this person, and they have these struggles, but they also have these good qualities, and they're just a normal character like everybody else in the book.
Thank you for sharing that. I definitely feel very strongly about the presentation of mental illness. I have some mental illness issues myself, so it's really good to have media that can present it as healthily as possible and So I appreciate that in your writing.
Oh, well, thank you very much, and thank you for bringing it up, because the American Psychiatry Association suggests or supposes that right now in America, 1 out of every 3 adults has some kind of mental health issue. So if, listeners out there, if you don't think you know anyone who does, you totally do, and you're just probably not seeing it. So take the time to figure out who needs your help and how you can help them.
Second that. Okay, I guess going back to the John Cleaver books. So one thing I've been curious about for a long time is, why is it that you chose specifically Gacy to be John's namesake?
Well, for one thing, because he was very recognizable, and I was worried that if I did somebody weird that no one had ever heard of, Herbert Mullen, as fantastic as he would be to base a character around, not everybody knows that name, and if you do, you don't necessarily know what he did. And some of the more famous ones, there's actually, I think, much more Son of Sam in John Cleaver than there is John Wayne Gacy. But he's very clearly named, designed to, John Wayne Cleaver is a name designed to invoke John Wayne Gacy. And that's because of the classic image of the clown, I think represents so much about serial killer psychology and sociopathic psychology. The idea that you present one face to the world, and under the surface there's something completely just 180 degrees different. And Gacy represents that, at least for me, really, really well. He was, one of the lines that John Cleaver uses in the book is that, 362 days out of the year, he was the best neighbor anyone had. He was popular at parties, people liked him, kids liked him, and then 3 days out of the year, he would go out and he would murder people and chop them up and put them in his basement. And the idea that those 2 people are actually just the same person and can swing so wildly from one extreme to the other is really just it's the perfect metaphor for that category as a whole. And so John Wayne Gacy made a very, very easy shorthand to get that point across.
So one thing I'm also curious about is kind of what sort of went into your creative process when you were planning the Wither, the monsters of your books.
Well, that's a good question because the Withered were kind of reverse engineered, really, more than anything else. I wrote the first book. I wrote I Am Not a Serial Killer with very specific needs. I wanted it to be supernatural because that's what I'd grown up reading. It could have very easily, I feel, been just a straight crime novel, but I wanted that supernatural element specifically because one of the things about sociopathy is that people with sociopathy feel distinct and separate from the rest of society. Whether they feel that they are better than us or worse than us, whatever it is, they feel different. They feel like they're not connected. And so the idea of a human being who cannot connect with other human beings, looking at a monster who is literally inhuman but can connect, that he is closer to humanity than John Cleaver is, that kind of was the whole idea in a nutshell for me. And so in the process of creating a monster like that, someone who is fundamentally not us, but who can live among us and learn to love us, is where Mr. Crowley comes from. And then as the series went on, I realized, and my editor at the time, Moshe Feder, he was the first one who pointed it out to me, was I needed some kind of consistent mythology. Now that I had multiple creatures, I either needed to find a single explanation for all of them or come up with something, and I didn't want to do kind of the Buffy Hellmouth idea. I wanted to be a little more original than that, rather than relying on other people's ideas. So it wasn't until book 4, when I got into the second trilogy, that I sat down and said, you know what, I need to I need to explain something about where these things are and where they come from. The basic premise established with Mr. Crowley that I had to work around with all the rest of the monsters was that they're kind of parallel to and parasitic of our own society. That they all lack something fundamental that makes them inhuman, but they can get it in a weird kind of outsized way. So Mr. Crowley did not have his own body, but he could steal bodies from other people. And then in the second book, you've got someone who does not have their own emotions and can only feel other people's emotions. And then the third book, the monster in that Nobody is someone who does not have her own identity and has to kind of steal identity and sense of self from other people. And, kind of building on that idea is where we get into The Withered. And by the time you get into books, I guess this is explained a little bit even as early as 4, but definitely by 6, you realize that there is kind of this whole community of them and that they are actually, humans who have changed themselves. They gave up something they thought they didn't want in order to get power or to get freedom or to get something else. But, in losing that one fundamental part of humanity, they realize that they are now forever distinct. They're forever othered, and they will never be able to come back. And that was a really... that to me was the key to making the second trilogy work, was that idea of willfully giving up your humanity, which is why in all 3 of those books of the second trilogy, books 4, 5, and 6, that's kind of a question that John wrestles with is, I know that I'm human, I know that I can connect to other people now, I've learned all those lessons from the first trilogy, but now I have the choice of whether I want to leave and whether I want to go be something else now. So that's kind of my ramblings about The Withered.
I really love The Withered because they have so much in common with our hero, which is so unique, I feel like, in a lot of horror. Sometimes, we have horror where bad things are happening to good people or to bad people or whatever, but I love that John has to struggle to find his humanity even when faced with this kind of alternative. So I really feel like that kind of helps the story stand apart from a lot of other horror.
Well, thank you very much. And I think that all springs back from that original concept for Mr. Crowley, that I wanted the monster who could love and connect to humans, and that changed everything. Once we had that, once we had a group of people who did not just consider us food or toys or whatever, then that really kind of altered the way that the rest of them came out. Even the ones that hate us, even the straight up villains like you get in book 4 and things like that, they are different, and we can see our bits of ourselves in them. Because they come from us and because they'll never be complete without us.
Something that I really found interesting hearing you talk about the series, especially like on writing excuses, was that the popularity of the series is really taken off in Germany. What do you think it is about maybe German culture that made it stand out there more than maybe in the U.S.?
I'm not certain that there's anything specific we can say about German culture that fits this book, but certainly the German book market. This feels like a cop-out answer, but in America, the biggest genre by a mile and a half is romance. That is what sells in America more than anything else. And in Germany, and to a lesser degree most of continental Europe, the big genre is crime. That is their romance. That's what everybody reads. That's what dominates bookstores and grocery checkout lines, is crime fiction. And also, they have a tendency to group horror and crime fiction into the same place. In Germany, they tend to share the same shelves. And in France, they actually have a very specific genre called polar, which includes both crime fiction and thrillers and horror, all under one umbrella. And so because of that, I think it was just easier for people to find it. In America, I'm Not a Serial Killer is kind of a weird niche thing. First of all, you have to be into horror, and second of all, you have to be in this weird kind of melancholy horror. Whereas in Germany, it's just mainstream fiction and everybody reads it. So I think it was just easier for people to find and easier for them to latch onto just because of the way their book market works.
Makes sense.
But it's been interesting. I mean, not to go too far into my other books because you're mostly talking about horror here, but all of my books sell differently in different markets, which makes sense. The thrillers are all much bigger in Europe than they are in the U.S., whereas my science fiction is much bigger in the U.S. than it is in Europe. All of the John Cleaver books have been national bestsellers in Germany, all 6 of them. Whereas the first Partials book, when it was released, I think we sold about 2,000 copies in Germany, which is nothing. And so it's been interesting, and once we figured out how to do it, it's been a lot of fun to kind of navigate these different markets and say, oh, well, what do they read in Argentina? Well, we've got something for that. And just then watch it take off because we kind of understand what the market is looking for now.
Yeah, and definitely your career has resulted in so many types of books. It's kind of interesting to see how broad of an audience that you can pull in, but maybe they might only look at one of your series at a time.
Well, the hope, the ideal situation is that someone will read one of my series and then say, oh, well, I like this author, but I've never read horror, or I've never read cyberpunk, or I've never read post-apocalypse. I'm going to give that a shot anyway just because I like the author. And we see a little bit of that, which is good. Right now, the 2 of the big genres that I read all the time and have never written books in, or at least have never published books in, are historical fiction and fantasy. And this year, those are the 2 that I'm writing. So I think at this point my agent's just thrown up her hands and said, whatever, Dan, write whatever you want and we'll do our best. Because I don't have a consistent brand other than Dan Wells,
I, for one, have enjoyed the variety. So I guess kind of moving towards wrapping up here, what can we expect from you coming forward? Like, what sort of upcoming projects can we look forward to?
The manuscript that I just finished a week or two, I think it was last week, about a week and a half ago, it was The Apocalypse Guard, which is a young adult science fiction that I am co-writing with Brandon Sanderson. And the 2 of us have been friends forever, long before either of us were published. We've always talked about writing together, and now we are. So that one is not sold anywhere. He wrote a draft, I wrote a draft. Now it's back with him again. We're kind of ping-ponging the book back and forth, and it's been a lot of fun to watch the different voices that arise when the 2 of us work together. So that will come out at some point. I don't know when. The project that I'm currently working on right now, that I spent most of the day on today, is called Ghost Station, which is my historical fiction about spies in the Cold War in Berlin. That was previously called Player Piano. I've changed the name because Ghost Station sounds way cooler. Though, to be on the other hand, Ghost Station does sound much more like a horror title, and I worry that people will pick it up thinking there's going to be genre elements. And there's not. It's just historical fiction. It's about cryptographers. So that one is a lot of fun. It's very different. It is far more different from anything I've written than anything else that I've written. That sentence doesn't sound like it makes sense, but it does. But yeah, it's a just kind of a straight spy thriller set in the early 60s in Berlin. And anyway, so that's what I'm working on. I hope to have that project. The book's finished. I'm going back and I'm doing a big polish rewrite on it. And I hope to have that done by the end of May. And then the rest of the year is dedicated to my science fiction, fantasy, big, crazy crossover book.
Exciting stuff.
I hope so.
Where can people find you online?
Okay, so I am the Dan Wells. There's also a just Dan Wells, and he is an actor and a bodybuilder in Hollywood, and he's awesome. and we have the same name, and he got to everything first. So he has Dan Wells on Twitter and danwells.com, etc., etc. And so if you have tried to contact me online and instead you've gotten this really handsome-looking actor bodybuilder guy telling you that he's the wrong one, that was him. And it happens often enough that we know each other at this point. So I am the Dan Wells. And that is my website, that is my email, that is my Twitter, that is Facebook, that's everything. thedanwells.com.
All right, and then is there any currently available book that you're especially wanting to pitch?
Well, the most recent is called Active Memory, which is the third book in my Cyberpunk series. It came out in February, and it is wonderful. If you've never read anything by me, ever, and if John Cleaver doesn't sound interesting to you, then the next one I recommend is called Extreme Makeover. It's a standalone science fiction about cloning and kind of the world of beauty companies. And that I consider one of my very best books, and that's kind of where I tell people to start, is either with I'm Not a Serial Killer or Extreme Makeover.
And having read all of your books, I can say that, yeah, they're all great. So no matter where you go to pick up a Dan Wells book, you're not going to be disappointed.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for being on the podcast. I think we should be good to wrap this up.
Well, wonderful. Thank you very much for having me on your show.
Oh man, what a great interview.
Oh, I don't know. I'm getting goosebumps thinking of how excited I am for where we're going.
Now, I guess one thing that we didn't really have a chance to do when I was on with Dan, because I think his level of bites might not quite work out as far as kind of what we usually do, talk a little bit more about what we think the I Am Not a Serial Killer film, and specifically take the opportunity to give it our rating.
Yeah, this is really such a fun movie that we've been able to see, and we watched it together, and it's very, very groundbreaking, I think, as far as horror goes, and especially too, as well as mental health and how they kind of tackle that and show it in almost a darker light, but still maintaining the respect. I think it's a brilliant movie.
I have to agree. I mean, there's definitely a reason why the book appealed to me so much, and then the entire series, and then when I heard that they were finally going to be able to make a movie, I was just super excited. So when it first came out, it wasn't widely available in theaters. There's a very limited release, but it was available on demand really quickly. So as soon as it came out, I got some friends together, and we watched it right away. And then later on, when it moved to Netflix, I was able to show Max the movie. But yeah, I was kind of first in line to see it. It was just sort of my attitude. And so it was just a really cool opportunity to finally see this book that I enjoyed several years ago in a film setting, when I honestly never expected to be able to see this particular piece of literature in a film setting. So it's really cool to see something I already loved get turned into a movie when I never thought that would even be possible, especially with such great actors as this.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the casting for this movie is phenomenal. Not only for John Wayne Cleaver, kind of the lead, but we've got Christopher Lloyd as Mr. Crowley, which, who doesn't love Christopher Lloyd?
As far as Christopher Lloyd goes, it's really cool to see him in a humorous setting. I know that he's said in several interviews that this was kind of a fun break from what's kind of become the established norm. He's always the kooky old man, and has been since the 80s, ever since Back to the Future. So this is just such a cool opportunity for him to show off his range as an actor, and I think he really killed it.
And again, not only him, but I feel like the whole cast, it does have a very indie feel, the movie, but at the same time, the cast is just so spot on. It's really hard to find something to critique, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. I feel it's a very strong film. Honestly, if I had to pick anything less and in love with about it. It would just be maybe some of the dialogue could have been a little bit more forward in terms of how it balanced with the background music, but that's kind of straining at an app.
For me, I think my biggest critique of the film is kind of the pacing. I felt like it took quite a while to kind of get into its rhythm. I understand why they kind of did that, and it is an indie film, and so there are some differences there, but at some points I just kind of felt like, okay, let's move along a little bit, and so that would probably be one of my biggest critiques, I'd say, if not the only critique.
Yeah, and honestly, I would say that was something that bothered me less. It definitely, they were very clearly going for kind of a 70s or 80s horror aesthetic tone, and the pacing and everything that kind of went into how that film was made. And so I felt like it was a very deliberate choice to have it paced that way, and I felt like it worked. There might have been a few moments that kind of dragged on a little bit, but as a whole, I felt like it made it feel quiet and contemplative, which really made the moments of horror pop out to me.
I can see where you're coming from, but I've got to stick to my guns on this, and that, I don't know, I just kind of felt at some parts, especially in the beginning, that it just needed a little something extra to kind of push it along. It eventually gets to the point where things really start to pick up and, shit kind of hits the fan, but in the beginning, I don't know, I was kind of wanting a little bit more information about what the situation was actually happening.
Fair. And definitely, the mystery is a big part of it, but I can see how it might not have worked as well. And it's kind of cool to see that it didn't work as well for you at the beginning, because, I knew what was going to happen, so I think that might have made it a bit easier for me to get through those sections.
Right, I was just going to say, where you had read the book, you kind of knew what to expect, and, you had this idea in the back of your head of, okay, this character is doing this, and someone who hasn't read the book, unfortunately, it's on my to-do list, I think that's a good point that you made, is that we had this kind of different viewpoint of what was going on.
So I guess we've kind of touched on what we didn't like about it as much. Now let's dig into what really stood out in the film. What really is one of your favorite scenes or moments or aspects of the film?
So kind of it's twofold, and I don't really have a specific scene per se, just because I think the movie was so great. But two things that really stuck out with me is, I'm a huge advocate of mental health. I think there is a lot of underrepresentation in the media and a lot of kind of exaggeration of what it really isn't. And I think this movie really buckled down and showed a side of mental health that it's kind of dark and twisted, but at the same time, we need to understand that, mental health is a very hard place to be in sometimes. I've struggled with depression, anxiety, and, there are moments where you just feel like you're suffocating or you're drowning and you don't know what to do. And I think this movie really portrayed that kind of internal struggle so well. With John Cleaver and his kind of struggle between, I am not a serial killer, but I have these tendencies, and what do I do with them?
Yeah. In the interview, Dan and I, really kind of dug into mental health and its way it's portrayed. But, I do just want to underline again, I love the fact that, we're able to see a sociopath who is actively working on what that means for him as a member of society, someone who is suffering from a mental illness but doesn't want that to be his sole defining characteristic, and not wanting all of the bad stereotypes and all of the things that could potentially be bad because of it be what defines him.
And I think that raises a good point that, in society, whenever we hear the term sociopath, we automatically assume, some Ted Bundy, Jim Jones kind of a persona who's just completely out of their mind and, just murderous rampage. And, by definition, that's not what it means. And this movie really gives you insight into this struggle between, this lack of empathy, but at the same time having a very strict code of morals and sticking to them.
Yeah, and feeling frustrated regularly and confused because you don't understand emotions the same way as others do. And I gotta give props to Max Records for his excellent acting as John, because there's definitely moments where you really feel, man, like, yeah, he wants to pull out his hair because he just doesn't understand why other people think the way they do or feel the way they do.
So probably my second favorite thing about this movie, and again, there's not really I mean, there are a lot of scenes that I can pick out, but none of them kind of do what I'm about to talk about to me, is that it really does a fantastic job at showing the complexity of murder. And I know that kind of sounds creepy to say.
It's our podcast. Just
it's true.
Roll
I've summoned a demon on this podcast, so talking about murder is probably far from that.
Yeah, this is kind of benign in comparison to some of the things we do.
But just how methodical murder really is, you know? Again, in typical media that you see, especially horror, murder is portrayed as this, like, clean process that you do in 30 minutes, and there's hardly any blood, and you can clean it up real quick, and that's just not true. There's so much blood in the human body, and you know, to stab someone or to cut them in any way, there's gonna be a lot of cleanup. And blood coagulates, and that makes cleanup not easy. And I don't know, I just thought it did a really, really good job at showing that, you know, to have pre-calculated murder, it takes a lot of effort, a lot of energy into planning that out.
And I love how that's kind of mirrored with the fact that John has to go to similar lengths to not murder, but, you know, to kind of make steps towards, you know, uncovering this mystery and confronting Crowley and all of that. It's very complex kind of from both sides. You know, you see the murderer and you see the hero, and they kind of don't function normally, but they both have to kind of go through a lot of the same steps in order to achieve what they need to.
Absolutely. It kind of takes that protagonist-antagonist motif and strips it away, and you have to kind of reconstruct it. You know, you've got this murderer with morals, and is he the protagonist or the antagonist? And you have to decide that for yourself.
Yeah, that really does a good job of transitioning into one of my favorite aspects of the film, which was how well it portrayed Crowley and like, you know, his relationship with his wife and his relationship with his neighbors, and how underneath all of that he had to do something that, you know, he used to not care about, but now he has to, you know, do in spite of kind of everything that he has kind of come to stand for in his community, and had to kind of shaped his whole existence around his love for this woman. And the cost of that is that he has to murder to continue to be with her. And that's kind of a really complex and sympathetic sort of thing to see a monster have to do. You know, it's weird that we're much more prone to empathize with this villain than we are with the hero. And I feel like that's, you know, both the, you know, one of the most horrific aspects of the film, and also one of the just best in terms of storytelling. You know, what makes it so compelling to watch or read.
So to keep this episode from being like 3 hours long,
yeah, we better wrap up.
What would you say, you know, your favorite part of this movie/book would be? And you have to pick one, Nathaniel.
I feel like in many ways my favorite part is when it's revealed that Crowley is a monster, not just a killer.
Agreed.
And that scene that really kind of turns everything on its head, where he, you know, picks up that, you know, homeless man who is going to try to stab and rob him, and you're expecting, oh, he's the murderer, he's the one who's doing this. You know, that homeless guy is the problem. And, you know, as a viewer, you don't know what's going to happen. You're like, oh man, like the nice old man from next door is going to die. And then he turns around and just, like, extends this giant claw and stabs the dude. And steals his organs.
One of those classic horror, oh shit moments, where you really are like, oh, and not a lot of horror movies nowadays can do this.
Yeah, or nearly as effectively. And so I love how it kind of takes everything you're expecting, because you are having, a very realistic, clinical look at, okay, this is how serial killers work. You find out that it's a supernatural serial killer, and it's the nice old man from next door who loves his wife. So that moment really just kind of probably speaks to me, most as kind of something that I want to do as a writer, to be able to have a moment that is that, kind of kick you in the face, but in a good way with the storytelling.
Agreed. All right, so as far as Screams and Grounds go, as far as Screams, where would you say this lies? Is scary and frightening?
I feel like a lot of the horror is kind of more existential in this, and so I put it at a 6. It is scary, and there are some really strong horror moments, but it didn't scare the crap out of me by any means. I think it's a fantastic horror film, but it doesn't keep up at night as much as a lot of things.
I'd agree. I think a lot of the scares and a lot of the intensity behind this movie are much more subtle. I would probably give it a 5, but honestly, nothing in this show scared me per se. But at the same time, the scares were very intelligent and very thought out, and that's why I've got to give it a 5.
Okay, so now let's talk Crowns. What would you rate it as an overall film?
I would probably give it an 8. The acting was superb. The story and plot is just really intricate and very thought out. But again, I felt like it had a lot of issues with timing, especially in the beginning. And sometimes I felt like I needed more background information about the main character. Yeah, I don't know. For some reason, my heart is really steadfast on a number 8 instead of pushing it to a 9, which I think it definitely does deserve, but as far as my experience with it, I'd give it an 8.
I would have to give it an 8 as well. I really thought hard about giving it a 9, because I really do love the film a lot. But I do have to agree that there are a few aspects of the film that I feel like that the book did a better job of bringing forward. And I think that some of the moments in the film kind of almost function more as subtle nods to the book that should have been more explicitly portrayed in the film. For example, the fact that John is specifically really interested in Gacy, which is why he dresses up as, a clown for Halloween. That was something that I thought was really interesting because, he's John Wayne Cleaver, and, even though his parents actually named him after John Wayne, the actor, he himself, kind of identified with John Wayne Gacy. But yeah, so I mean, I just feel like there's a lot of moments that it's cool if you know what you're looking for, but I feel like the movie could have maybe more explicitly said hey, this is what we're doing with the scene. And I appreciate subtlety, but I feel like sometimes it went too subtle, so a lot of the audience would miss things that really are some of my favorite aspects of the story.
And I think that's kind of where I want to rate it as an 8, because I didn't know that. And I appreciate a movie that kind of gives an homage to its readers. If it started out as a book, I think that is, a very awesome characteristic of a movie. But yeah, not reading the book, sometimes I felt a little lost in places and wanted more, and it never executed.
So I guess that puts us at 5.5 screams and a solid 8 as rating for Crowns.
And moral of the story is it's a fantastic movie. If you want a good horror/thriller, definitely watch this one.
Yeah, and I think it's a really accessible film for people who, if you want to show a horror movie to people who aren't super huge horror people, I feel like it's going to work for a lot wider of an audience than a lot of other horror films that we've covered may work. All right, so I guess just some quick housekeeping then, and then we'll wrap this up.
Agreed. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, so you have a new Twitter handle.
I do. So I had a personal Twitter, but it was set on private for personal reasons, and so I decided to create my own new Twitter handle that y'all need to check out because I have a grand old time. Twitter handle is at Crowley Finn, and it's kind of spelled a little differently. It's CROWLEYPHOEN. And that is an homage. Exactly, yeah. It's an homage to Aleister Crowley, who was a huge kind of game player in American occult, and as well as just kind of generic occult in general. He's a fascinating human being, and some people say he was the Antichrist. I don't believe that, but a lot of people do.
We'll definitely cover him in much more detail in a future episode.
Absolutely. He's one of my favorite people to study. And then Finn, the PHOEN, it comes from, like you said, phoenix, which is an animal that I am very attracted to. It has a lot of symbolism for my life. And so I kind of combined the two and created my own little occult name, Finn Crowley. It helps me fit in with the Wiccans a little bit better because they all rename themselves. And so yeah, come check us out. I do a lot of questions that we like to ask, scariest movies or Monday moans. We complain about terrible things that happen on Monday. And I also like for advice about, occult things or give advice to my listeners. So please definitely check me out. Again, it's at Crowley Finn, and Finn is PHOEN.
And then, of course, my Twitter handle is at NJDarkish. That has not changed. Or you can also check out the podcasts, much less than we should use it, handle at Scream Kings Pod. You can also be emailed at screamkingspodcast@gmail.com. We have a Facebook group. Just if you type Scream Kings into Google, you'll find us.
All right. Well, we are excited for a few of our episodes that are coming up. We're planning on doing some great movies like The Ring, The Exorcist. There's an occult movie that I want Nathaniel to see so much. It's called A Dark Song. It's beautiful. It's actually about one of the rituals Aleister Crowley performed. We've got a lot of fun stuff coming up. And hopefully
John Carpenter's Apocalypse trilogy.
Yeah, exactly. There's a bunch. So get excited.
And also, we're going to be doing a lot more with our individual features going forward. I feel like that's something that's kind of been missing from a lot of our episodes recently, and we want to really bring those back in. So I expect a lot more of the Occult Corner and Studying the Strange. So awesome.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for listening again. We love and appreciate your support. If you would so generously, please leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us out so much. Kind of gets our name out there, but we would love to hear feedback from you.
Yeah, also, if you just want to tell a friend, drop a link on Twitter, anything is enormously appreciated, and it, just take a few seconds of your time, and it really does make a huge difference for us. So we appreciate everything that, all of the good proselytizing of our podcast so far.
All right, stay spooky, people!